Good morning. This is Marshall Davis. As I am recording this, I'm in the middle of a snowstorm here in New Hampshire. We're supposed to get over a foot of snow, so I'm not going out anywhere today. So I thought this would be a good day to record another episode. Occasionally, I am interviewed as a guest on a podcast or a YouTube channel or even a live radio show. And usually early in the interview, I am asked to describe my spiritual experience of non-dual awareness, especially how it came about. Consequently, I've told the story many times, and I've told it also in my books and on this podcast and YouTube channel. And after the last interview I did for a podcast, I was thinking about how I could cut out all those personal autobiographical details and cut right to the heart of the matter. And what came to my mind was the children's nursery rhyme about Humpty Dumpty. It's a good metaphor, I think, for human life, and it's a story of my life. One might call it the parable of Humpty Dumpty. Let me recite this nursery rhyme for you. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. That, in a nutshell, or I should say an eggshell, is the story of my life. It's a story of the end of the self. And let me explain. When I tell the story of spiritual awakening into non-dual awareness, I always say that it happened in three distinct experiences, each one 20 years apart. So the whole process took 40 years, which I would not recommend. It's a long time, and it's completely unnecessary. Non-dual awareness is right here now. No time is needed to know that and to realize that. But for me, it took 40 years to realize that. 40 happens to be a symbolic number in the Bible. 40 days of rain during Noah's flood, 40 years in the wilderness for the people of Israel, 40 days that Jesus spent in the wilderness after his baptism, and then it became 40 days of Lent in the Christian calendar. It took 40 years from my first encounter with the mystery of holiness that we call God to when that mystery became the present conscious reality of my life. And this is where Humpty Dumpty comes in. In Lewis Carroll's book, Through the Looking Glass, he is described as an egg, which is important for the metaphor. Without getting into the personal details, the first time when I became conscious of what Rudolf Otto calls the mysterium tremendum, the shell of myself, of the self, was fractured. I told my girlfriend at the time, now my wife of 48 years, who was present then, at the moment, that it felt like God barely brushed me with the tip of his finger, but it was enough to do me in. I was undone, as Isaiah says of his experience. The shell of the self cracked that night, and it never healed, thank God. When I am buying eggs at the grocery store, I always open up the carton to see if there are any cracked eggs, see if there are any little tiny cracks. Maybe you do the same thing. An egg may not be completely broken open. In fact, the membrane underneath may still be intact, but you can tell by looking at it that the structure of the shell has lost its integrity. And if that's the case, then I put that carton aside and I move on to another carton of eggs. The self is like a shell. And my self cracked that night in 1973. The second time was about 20 years later. Once again, without getting into the autobiographical details, that second time the shell of the self was completely shattered. If the first occasion was a single hairline crack in the shell, then this time the whole shell was shattered all over. At the time, I described it to my spiritual director as feeling like I was falling into an abyss. Now, I likened it to Humpty Dumpty falling off a wall. If you have ever peeled a hard-boiled egg, you know what it looks like when you shatter the whole surface of the egg before you start peeling the shell away. Well, that's what happened to me in 1993. The shell of the self was completely shattered, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty back together again. And believe me, I tried to put it back together again. Instead of embracing the loss of the self and exploring no self, I was scared, and I tried to put the pieces of the self back together again. Instead of accepting the death of the self and moving on to a resurrection awareness, I tried to pick up the pieces of my shattered self the best I could and to carry on. And I did that by retreating back into a conservative evangelicalism, which I felt was safe at the time. I covered the shattered shell of the self with the clothing of evangelical Christianity, and I convinced myself that I was whole once again. I decorated the shell in Christian colors just like one would decorate an Easter egg. I thought in doing this that it would keep me safe together in one piece, but of course it didn't. The shell of the self was completely damaged beyond repair. That stage lasted another 20 years until 2012. This third time was a final falling away of the shell and the unveiling of what I really am, what we really are. It was 3 times. 3 is also a very symbolic number in the Bible. Everything in the Bible is confirmed in 3s. An event is confirmed on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Peter denied Christ 3 times before the crucifixion, so he had to affirm Christ 3 times after the resurrection. Jesus rose on the 3rd day, and the 3rd time was decisive, was resurrection for me as well. Once again, without the autobiographical details, on this occasion the shattered shell of my individual self fell away permanently. I did not have the energy to put it back together again, to be honest, for it had taken a lot of effort to keep that self in place, especially when it was broken in so many pieces for those 20 years. In the couple of years leading up to this 3rd occasion, I had begun to examine closely this self I had constructed and began to deconstruct it and to deconstruct my Christianity. It was like I was taking off the individual pieces of the shell very carefully, piece by piece, until there was too little left to keep it together. And then the self fell away completely. But unlike the first 2 times, this time there was no fear at all. It was liberating. It was liberation. It was disorienting, but in a good way. After the fact, I realized there had never been anything to be afraid of in the first place. The self is only a shell. It's not what we really are. We are not an individual, separated being apart from everything else, no matter how much we convince ourselves of that and how much we dress up the self in religious or spiritual garb, making it a very spiritual self. Then if we are not the self, What are we? When I was growing up, my mother taught me how to make a special type of Easter egg. They were not the typical hard-boiled egg dyed with colors. She taught me and my brother and sister to puncture a tiny hole in each end of a raw egg and then blow into it. And if you blow hard enough and you shake up that egg every once in a while, and you blow long enough, then all of the contents of the egg liquefy and come out. Both the white and the yolk come out the other end of the hole, and the end result is a very light and completely hollow egg. Then we would take a little bit of the egg white that had come out, and we would apply it to the ends of the egg to seal the tiny holes, leaving a perfectly whole, hollow egg, which we would then decorate. That type of Easter egg is said to symbolize the empty tomb of Jesus on Easter morning. It's also a very good symbol for what we really are, which is what the story of the empty tomb really means. When that shell of the self fell away completely on this third occasion, I saw there was nothing inside. That is what I had glimpsed the first two times, and the emptiness had scared me to death, but this third time it was a relief. No fear. It was joy and peace. When the shell of the self falls away, we see that what we are on the inside is what is on the outside. When the shell is gone, the inside space is reunited with the outside space to be one spacious fullness, which is what we have always been, what we always are, but did not realize it. There is no separate little entity inside of us called the self. That idea of a self in this body somewhere, in our head or in our torso or something, is simply a fiction. Now, there is thinking going on and feeling and perceiving, but there's no self doing all that. There's only the whole, not a being, but simply being, what Taylor calls being itself. That wholeness is what we call God, or the divine, or the holy, or whatever, religious designation you want to call it, Christ, or the Buddha, or whatever, Atman, Brahman. The realization of no self and the realization of God are the same. They're two aspects of one non-dual reality. The moment of realizing the reconnection of the inside with the outside is reconciliation. Reconciling the inside and the outside, the up with the down, heaven with earth, God with humans. This is the literal meaning of the word atonement, which is at one-ment. Being at one with God, oneness with God, comes about simultaneously with seeing through the illusion of the self. There's nothing more than a flimsy shell. That death of the self is what Jesus' death on the cross points to. At that time of this realization, all the language of Christianity made sense, not in the dogmatic theological way, but in a spiritual, experiential way. I just intuitively knew what it was all pointing to. With the death of the self, we are reborn to what we always have been, to what we were before we were born. I see ourselves to be the unborn, the eternal, the infinite. We have always been this. One reality. It's just that we have constructed a shell between the inside and the outside, between us and God. The way to what Jesus calls eternal life is to let go and fall off the wall like Humpty Dumpty. Let the pieces of the self shatter and fall away, and do not try to put the pieces back together again. That is the meaning of the parable of Humpty Dumpty. And that is it for today. Grace and peace to you.